So welcome everyone again to our virtual talk for December. Excited today to have with us Andrew Liptak, who is one of my colleagues here at the Vermont Historical Society, and really an awesome person. And so he's going to be talking to us about the history of cosplay in Vermont, among other things. And I'm going to just give a brief intro and turn it over to him to get going. So Andrew is our PR and guest services coordinator. So you'll often find him at the museum when you go. He's also the author of Cosplay a History, which delves into the history of costuming and the modern cosplay movement to explore what it means for the relationships that fans have with properties, the technological advances that play a central role in its formation, and the ways that people have dressed up in costume over the years. Prior to working at VHS, he worked as a journalist for more than a decade, appearing in publications such as Clarkesworld Magazine, Cosplay Central, Gizmodo, Grist, IO9, 10, Polygon, Slate, Uncanny Magazine, The Verge, and other publications. He writes a regular newsletter about the intersection of speculative fiction and real life called Transfer Orbit. And you can find the link to Transfer Orbit on our website. And I'll also throw in a link to his book, Cosplay History, as well, if you'd like to purchase that. Andrew, take it away.
Hi. So, yeah, I will admit right up front, I'm a bit of a nerd. I have been really excited to talk about this because over here at the museum in Montpelier, where I am right now, we recently set up, back in July, we set up an exhibit called A Stitch in Time, which is about the history of fashion. It's a rotating exhibit where we take a couple of items from our collection and pair it up with a modern day equivalent. At the same time, we have an exhibit in the local history gallery called Fancy Goods from the Middletown Springs Historical Society, which is all about sort of the fancy accessories that people bought between 1850 and 1950. So I wanted to talk a bit about another part of Vermont culture that has to do with fashion to sort of tie in with those exhibits. And given that I wrote a history of cosplay and costuming, it seemed like a good idea to do that. So let me just get started. I have a PowerPoint that will hopefully work. Let me see if I can. There we go. So about me, Eileen gave a bit of a bio. A little bit further back. I grew up here in Vermont. I went to Harwood Union High School, and my first encounter with what we call cosplay was back in May 2003. I was a high school senior, and for about 6 years, I pestered my high school band director to play this music from Star Wars. And after 6 years, he relented, and to make, that was very cool in and of itself, but just to make it a little bit better, I had heard about this fan group called the 501st Legion, who are known for dressing up as Imperial Stormtroopers and Darth Vader and all the bad guys from Star Wars. And I convinced Mr. Rivers to invite one of them over, and this is from that concert. A guy named Scott Allen, who drove all the way up from Rhode Island to take part and blew everybody away. And after the concert was over, I basically said, "Well, how do I do this for myself?" And he said, "Get in touch when you're ready." And later that summer, he sold me my first suit of armor, which is an Imperial Stormtrooper from the Star Wars films. And so this is my 20th year doing that. It's been a kind of a really fun and interesting ride. I began freelancing as a writer back around 2009, and I wrote for a whole bunch of websites. And my focus was always on popular culture, but also how does that intersect with the real world? So writing about what movies are coming out, what books, writing about books, and then writing about cosplay along the way. I wrote for IO9 and Gizmodo, were a sort of a nerd-centric website. IO9 was sort of the science fiction version. Gizmodo was a tech site. And so I basically worked on cosplay stuff there. And around that time, I was building a new set of armor. So I ran a series that basically followed my progress as I built this new set. Along the way, my editor, Joe Monty at Saga Press, got in touch. He had been to San Diego Comic-Con, I think around 2015. And he had heard this really incredible story about a guy who had dressed up as in a stormtrooper outfit and then marched 501 miles from Northern California to San Diego during the con. And he was like, "Is there a story here?" And like, "Yeah, it's a big group, and we have thousands and thousands of members around the world." And that's sort of the genesis of cosplay history. And along the way, I went to another website. I sold the book in February 2019. Finished my first draft a week before the COVID lockdowns happened in 2020, and the book came out in June 2022, and just a little bit after I had joined VHS. And that's the cover of the book. It's my attempt to take a look at the modern state of what cosplay is. And what cosplay is, if you haven't heard of it, is basically the act of dressing up as a fictional character and just sort of being out in the world with it. And it's a very much of a do-it-yourself hobby. A lot of people make their own costumes out of just about every material imaginable, and they go to plenty of conventions. Just about every weekend around the country and around the world, there's a convention of some sort taking place, or multiple conventions taking place. We see it popping up in major Hollywood productions. A TV show called Miss Marvel had cosplay as a front and center fixture in one of the episodes, and there's been a bunch of other ones along the way. And then there's shows like The Big Bang Theory and others that have sort of pushed this sort of nerd culture and propelled it into the forefront of mainstream. So it wasn't so much this niche thing, and it became more of a mainstream thing. And so cosplay sort of has come a long ways along that route. And so I wanted to understand, so we have the modern state of cosplay, where did it come from? And so I basically started to backtrack and just look at not just the people who were cosplaying, but also the things that changed along the way. What types of technological innovations helped propel it? What types of social and cultural and entertainment things were going on that helped sort of make this a thing? And it's easy to sort of go back through the timeline, and then as you go further and further back, you find all sorts of examples of where cosplay sort of predecessors to what the modern day thing is. And so the book is sort of my attempt to sort of put that all up into one package and put it out into the world. And I had a lot of fun writing it, and it was a exciting project, and I learned a lot while writing it. So I want to. This presentation is going to be basically two parts. The first part is going to be sort of outlining a thumbnail of the history of cosplay and where it came from. And then the second half will be focusing on like, how does this relate to Vermont? Because when you think about Vermont, you don't really think about, superheroes all that much, although maybe you should. So the short version is we're storytelling creatures. We like stories, and we find ways to immerse ourselves in these fictional stories. And you can go back millennia to find examples of where people have been trying to tell stories, but also utilizing costumes as a way to tell those stories and to immerse themselves. There's lots and lots of early examples, and I think with anything with history, you can never really find a definitive first example of where something has come from. But there's a lot of early ones. So this is one example of that. It's a guy named Commodus. He was a Roman emperor from 177 to 192 BC, and AD. And that's him dressed as Hercules. He was a bit of an egomaniac and was obsessed with the character, and had a number of marble statues made up of him. It's not too much of a leap to think that somebody with his resources would probably have also dressed up as Hercules. And he really tried to emulate the character, and thought of himself as sort of a living persona of him. And he actually was went and fought in gladiator battles in Rome. And this is just one example. Unfortunately, it didn't make the book because I learned about it about a week or two after or a couple months after I turned in my draft, and couldn't put it in. But this is just one early example of where you see people emulating characters by dressing up as them, or having the appearance of dressing up as them. And there's other ones as we go up through the timeline as well. This is the Eglinton tournament of 1839 in Scotland, and this was a medieval tournament that was set up because a whole bunch of folks in the royal court in England thought that England was losing out on its pageantry, that the coronation of Victoria had stripped away some of the really ancient traditions that had been associated with the coronation. And they were distressed by this. They thought that, England was losing some part of themselves. And so they decided to rent out a whole bunch of suits of armor, camped out its land up in Scotland, and after a bit of training, decided to stage this large tournament that would basically be a reminder of what the pageantry was like way back when. And they went up and showed up. A couple 100,000 people in England showed up, and then it rained all 3 days of that weekend. And they didn't really get to do as much as they had hoped. But this is another really early example of like how people are leaning into costuming and pageantry as it relates to a story. They were thinking about the story of ancient or medieval England, and wanted to sort of bring that back because of the heroic stories and the things that they sort of associated with that time. Another, if we jump up a little bit more closely to our own time, this is an actress named Hedwig Reicher, who on March 3rd, 1913. This is in Washington, D.C., and she's dressed as Columbia during a suffragette march. And there were lots and lots of examples of these women who were dressing up as these characters, not just Columbia, but like Joan of Arc and Lady Liberty. They're doing so to make a point, and they were trying to sort of drive home this message of what these characters represent as it related to their struggle to gain the vote. And there's a whole lot of, you can go into the Library of Congress website and find a whole lot of examples of women doing this. They're on horses, they're dressed up in these really elegant robes. And it's a really powerful reminder of what stories can do. And you see this up to the modern day as well. A number of years ago, we had the Tea Party movement, and there were protesters who would dress up as figures from the American Revolution. There's also women who dress up as handmaids from The Handmaid's Tale to protest certain laws that are going into effect. These are examples of how people have tapped into the stories that exist out there in the world, pairing them up with costumes and using the costumes to sort of push that effect into the real world and sort of make people confront it. And it's just another example of just how powerful storytelling can be as a tool. On the pop culture side, I'll jump back to the late 1800s. This is the Vrilya Bazaar and Fete. It was held at the Royal Albert Hall in London, and it was a fundraising event, and it's sort of been billed as like the first Comic-Con. It was based roughly around a book called The Coming Race, which was a hollow world, like a proto science fiction novel with some Oriental or East Asian themes, and basically it was extremely popular after its publication. So the organizers decided, well, we need to raise some money for a hospital. Let's throw this multi-day thing. And people showed up, and they, as you can see in this engraving, they showed up in costume, and they showed up in some pretty elaborate costumes. There were reports of people decked out with electric lights in their headdresses. So this is not stuff that it's not uncommon to see that nowadays, but it was interesting to sort of learn that these sorts of things happened way back when. And there's other examples of this along the way. Jules Verne threw a costume party at his house, and people showed up as his characters from like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and others. And in Western North America, there was a popular cartoon called Mr. Skygack from Mars, a little alien-looking dude with a long nose and a notepad, and it would basically make these very literal observations of people. And there was some newspaper reports of people dressing up as this character for various purposes, costume masquerades, and I think one person was sort of advertising for a skating rink. So there's lots of examples as you go further back of people using costumes for non-theatrical purposes. They are either dressing up because they like the character, they're dressing up to sort of promote something, or they just wanted to have some fun with it. So these are sort of the predecessors to the modern cosplay movement as we see it today. Where we have the modern cosplay movement, we have to jump to 1939, New York City. This is the first ever World Science Fiction Convention, and the two people here are Forrest Ackerman and Myrtle Douglas, and they are two prominent fans in the science fiction community. They were from California, and they took a train over to New York for this convention it was held the same year as the World's Fair, and the science fiction fans at the time had been gathering in small groups, and they wanted to sort of have this big national gathering. And Worldcon was a little aspirational, just because everybody was from North America. But fans from New York City and across the country came to this convention to meet authors and editors and their other fellow fans. This is like Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov were there, and Forrest and Myrtle show up in these costumes. They are based off. They based them off of H.G. Wells' The Thing to Come, or a film adaptation that had come out at the time. And everybody sort of looked at them and was like, "What are you guys doing? This is kind of weird." But they took some pictures, and the next year they showed up again. And this is sort of a crucial point that I've wanted to make with this book, is that the first time you do anything is it's notable, but the second time you do it and the third time you do it is really important. So people started showing up to these conventions again and again and again. The next con was in the next year, 1940 in Chicago, then in 1941 in Denver, and then it basically traveled around the country a lot. And what happened is that people started showing up in costume because Forrest and Myrtle had shown up that first year. More people started showing up, and then it became this sort of formal event as a fixture, and it's still a fixture today at the World Science Fiction Convention. Most recently, it was held in China, and it became basically sort of this after party for the convention. People would show up and just sort of relax and have fun, and then they sort of introduced a costume contest, and then as you look through documents related to conventions, they would be sending out newsletters ahead of a con to basically say, like, all right, we're getting ready. Here's where you can go to your hotel. This is how you can, the rates. Here's who else is coming. And oh yeah, we have a costume party again this year. So here's some suggestions. And people were dressing up in these very elaborate and detailed costumes over time. And the sophistication increases and grows with each successive convention. This is an example from Denver Worldcon, July 1941. You can see Forrest sort of sitting there in the background. And there's some basic archetypes here. There's the cowboy, witch, and some other characters. And as time goes on, you just see the sophistication increase as you have more people are basing stuff off of book covers, or as films and TV shows start to become more of a thing. That's where you start to see people dressing up and basing their costumes on these prior examples. This is a man named Paul Anderson, and he's the co-founder of a group called the Society for Creative Acronism. And 1968 in Baycon in California, and he was a prominent science fiction writer, and he also basically founded this medieval sort of costuming group where they would reenact tournaments and fights in the armor and the costumes and clothing of the period. And it's not quite historically accurate. It's sort of they're sort of leaning into this idea in this heavily mythologized idea of medieval times. And they are sort of using these costumes as a way to sort of ingrain themselves in these worlds. Around the 1960s, this is sort of what I refer to as sort of a period of balkanization within science fiction fandom. So up until 1960s, a lot of science fiction fandom was largely confined to pulp magazines and novels. There were TV shows, there were comic books, there were radio serials, but a lot of these fans were really focused on the magazines that they'd be getting, and there'd be short stories and sometimes a full novel in each one of these. They'd write letters to one another and then go back and forth. And it's sort of, that's sort of where you have this whole community coalescing around this one product, essentially. And we start to see this split a little bit later on in 1960s when a show called Star Trek comes out. And what Star Trek does is it introduces people all across the country to this new genre that they might not have had access to. They might not have picked up the magazines, but they do have TV, and it ran on NBC for 3 seasons, and then it was canceled and then put into syndication. And so it was constantly being rerun all over the place. And so you see this influx of people joining the larger fandom movement. A lot of women joined up. A lot of these folks were not necessarily reading the stories, but they were sort of telling their own stories within the Star Trek universe. They were finding one another they were holding their own conventions, and they were making their own fanzines and writing letters amongst one another. So you start to see this fandom scene split into a couple smaller pieces. And it's not just Star Trek. Anime from Japan is brought over to the US 1970s, 1980s, and you see people watching this on public access TV or having screening rooms at conventions or at their high schools. And there's a lot of other films that come up along the way. You have, Battlestar Galactica, you've got Star Wars in the 1970s. And science fiction becomes this much bigger and bigger thing. And it's no longer just this one strand of a community that is basically just reading the magazines. So you see the costuming comes with it in each one of these different strands. You have people replicating the costumes they see in Star Trek. And one of the big reasons, I think, is that these costumes are really comfortable to wear. They are, easy. If you know your way around a sewing machine, you can easily put one together. They don't need to be that elaborate, but you can know instantly what they are. And there was some division within fandom about this because, there are folks who really thought that this needs to be sort of held to the masquerade at the convention at the designated programming time, and they referred to this as hall costuming, and a little bit divisively. And they just didn't didn't think that it was a sort of a proper way to be a fan, I guess. And there's still some attitudes like that, but it's sort of the cat's out of the bag. You see people more and more coming out of these pre-designated times and sort of showing up at conventions. They might just be in costume because they're comfortable, and it's just another way that they're expressing their fandom. We're going to jump ahead a little bit to the late 1990s. The group that I'm part of is the 501st Legion. We are a worldwide organization where we dress up as the bad guys from Star Wars. We have a sister group called the Rebel Legion, and they do all the good guys. There's the Mandalorian Mercs, who do a type of character called the Mandalorians, and there's a whole bunch of others along the way. The 501st is by far one of the largest. I believe last count we had about 15,000 people in the group worldwide, and it starts. It has its roots in the internet culture that comes up in the 1990s. People are going to message boards and are looking for armor, trading tips and tricks on how to make these costumes. There are websites like one called the Replica Props Forum, where people are learning how to make their own costumes from scratch to basically replicate what they see on TV. And that's sort of where part of this, the tradition where the 501st comes from. You have people making these types of armor, and this group was founded by a man named Alvin Johnson, who decided, I really like doing this. He showed up for the special editions in 1997 with a friend of his and realized that there's power in numbers, and they started recruiting and organizing and having more friends to find one another, and basically grew it into the group that it is today. So, as before we get to the state of costuming in Vermont, since the 2000s, the cosplay has become a much more mainstream thing, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We have a lot of big budget TV shows, a lot of big budget films coming out. Think back to things like the Lord of the Rings trilogy by Peter Jackson, Harry Potter, the return of the Star Wars films, TV shows like Game of Thrones, The Walking Dead. In a lot of ways, what was once fairly reviled and sort of not as popular genres, when I was growing up, it really wasn't cool to be a fan of comic books or a fan of Star Wars or be a fan of science fiction, even though a lot of people were fans. By the 2000s and 2010s, you see this tipping point where it becomes much more accepted in society, and there's a lot of reasons for that. You have a lot more content coming out. You have the growth of these big conventions, and as I mentioned before, you have shows like The Big Bang Theory, where it's people are finally getting to see this, their friends interacting with these types of franchises and taking part in costume and sort of realizing, I can do that maybe for Halloween next year or something like that. And so it becomes this much bigger thing, and certainly like groups like the 501st have benefited from that. You see conventions popping up all over the world. The San Diego Comic-Con, which was this really smaller the smaller event in San Diego, California, really grows and becomes this monumental juggernaut of an event that takes place over 4 or 5 days, where movie studios and actors will stop by to show the latest projects, and a lot of cosplayers show up to sort of show off their latest builds. And so that's sort of where we're at today. We have it's a much more recognizable thing. It's certainly not, if you just going by news clips, it's certainly not sort of condescended to, as it might have been. There was lots of jokes of all these losers and their costumes. Like, why don't they grow up? And that's not really the case anymore. So it's become a far more mainstream thing, and it has really become a vocation for a lot of people, and as they have found these communities of fellow fans. So that sort of brings me to the second half of this conversation, is costume in Vermont. Vermont is not immune to these changes in society. It's not a very, we're not a very big state. We're not nearly near the big epicenters of culture like New York City, where you have all the publishing houses, or Los Angeles, where you have all the movie studios, or any huge cities where you would have fans congregating. But there were fans who were writing letters. They were getting, they're getting the magazines in the mail, from the 1930s, 40s, 50s. There are examples of people writing letters to magazines. They're from Vermont. A famous horror writer named H.P. Lovecraft traveled up to Vermont, and he was friends with the man who founded, Orton, I can't remember his first name, who founded the Vermont Country Store. They were friends and sort of part of that same circle. You have writers who are from Vermont who are sending stories into these magazines, and you've got actors and other folks who are people in the community who are just generally enjoying reading comic books, or reading these stories, or reading these novels, or seeing these movies. And so what happens elsewhere in society is also happening here. So Vermonters have, accordingly, Vermonters have used costumes to tell various stories, including the story of Vermont's history. And one really good example that I found last year, or earlier this year, was an event down in southern Vermont, the opening of the Ethan Allen Highway. This was September 20th, 1930. The highway opened as this nice paved road. Before that, it had been all dirt, and it was not very passable. Yes, if any of you are in Vermont, you will know mud season is a thing. And to open this road, they threw this really big banquet. This really big parade. They dressed up dozens and dozens of cars in flowers and all sorts of decorations, and they issued a pamphlet that, as this parade went up the road and stopped at various historic locations, they were met by a historic figure, a volunteer dressed up as one of these historic figures. And these are people like Ethan Allen, Ira Allen, Moses Robinson, Thomas Chittenden, and quite a few others. And they, as the parade arrived at each station, they would greet the parade in character. And I think Ethan Allen basically, or somebody was quoted as saying, like, well, if we had this road back in the 1700s during the Revolutionary War, we would have had a much easier time of it. And so, like, they are they're leaning into the story with the costumes and sort of trying to bring that past to life just a little bit. This is a picture of Ethan Allen, a doctor named John D. Lane, and he was part of this parade. Looking through the Bennington Museum's archives, it seems like he actually did this quite a bit. There's a lot of pageantry around the founding of the country and the founding of the state down in Bennington, because it was sort of this epicenter. And so there were a lot of reenactors and people who were dressing up as these figures to sort of promote the past and promote the story of Vermont's role in the American Revolution. I'm going to fast forward several decades. If any of you are from the Rutland area, there's a big parade every Halloween down in the area. And this is kind of a really cool example of sort of pop culture in Vermont, because you sort of see this cross-pollination between fans and pros, and going back into fans. So this back in the 1950s, late 1950s, comic books were starting to become a little bit more popular, and the Rutland Recreation Department wanted to put up a big parade. Halloween has sort of a complicated history in the U.S. It was often a sort of a mischievous holiday, so there was lots of efforts, from the late 1800s, early 1900s, to try to keep kids under control. There's a lot of property damage. There were kids running around amok because it was sort of known for this holiday for mischievous actions and troublemaking, and so there was a lot of efforts for people to let's throw Halloween parties where we can keep everybody sort of indoors, and parades were another part of this. So 1959, Rutland starts the planning, and they basically hold their first parade in 1960. And one of the organizers was a guy named Tom Fagan, who was a local guy, and he was a local fan. He was a comic book fan, so he was going out to these conventions. He went to New York City Comic Con and would come back. And he was, to promote this parade, he was writing to fanzines to talk about oh, we have this big Halloween parade. We're bringing out all these characters who are, you might have seen in comic books. And Batman was a big get for them. 1961, they were able to bring in somebody dressed up as Batman. And other, as the years sort of progressed, there were other comic book characters that sort of made their appearances in this parade as sort of the highlight of it. Batman was, I think, there pretty much almost every year. And he started writing to the writers and the comic book artists and said hey, you should come and hang out with us. And they'd drive up from New York City, and they'd dress up in the costumes of the characters that they were writing. They go party a little bit. And then 1970, they start actually writing this parade into the comic books themselves. And this is a very cool, just weird intersection of pop culture in Vermont, because you have these superheroes who are basically called to Rutland, Vermont at the height of this parade, and they're seeing sort of their doppelgangers. And you start seeing the crowds, people are dressed up as the Marvel characters. And this is just an example of where people are dressing up as these figures, either as a parade, a fixture in the parade, or on the sidelines. And there was a lot of comics where this happens. And the most recent one was 1997, I think. We actually, this picture is from a comic that we recently added to the library, and we have a couple of other ones that are being added in. And as we find more, we'll be trying to find them and stick them in, so we can sort of preserve this little bit of corner of Vermont culture in the comic book world. And as I said, this sort of goes from fans to pros to fans, and you're starting seeing this cycle of this happening, this cross-pollination with culture. And one of the really neat things is that there's actually now a Batman statue in downtown Rutland to commemorate the parade. That was just installed this year, just ahead of this year's Rutland Halloween parade. And it was I actually marched in it. It was a really fun time. And there's lots of people who are dressed up, not only in the parade in costume, but everybody on the sidelines were dressed up as well. So this is just another example of where people have been leaning into pop culture, what they're seeing in pop culture, and sort of translating it into the real world by putting on costumes like that. Another part of that is conventions these days. So if we sort of fast forward to the modern day, how has that past sort of translated up into the modern day? There's other things here I sort of brushed over. There are lots of reenactors who are here operating here in the state. We've got the Hemlocks who do Civil War reenacting. A friend of mine in the local 501st chapter is a Civil War reenactor as well. There's folks who reenact for the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. And just over the river over the lake in New York, we have Fort Ticonderoga, where they actually have a very vibrant living history program where they are dressing up interpreters in costume in period uniforms to sort of bring that past to life just a little bit. And I sort of go back to what I was saying, what is happening in pop culture is not, Vermont is not isolated from that. So when Star Wars shows up in the theaters in 1977, it was showing up in theaters. It didn't actually show up in May. It showed up a couple months later. Theatrical runs were a little bit different way back then, but people were really excited for it. And you see this, comic book stores open up across the state, and they're holding their own conventions. I think the earliest convention that I was able to find was was here in Montpelier, 1970s. It was sort of like a science fiction show, trying to imagine what Vermont might look like in the future. A couple of Burlington comic book stores held the Burlington Comic Con in the mid 1980s, and then up into the mid 1980s, 1990s, there was a handful of conventions over the years, either comics or gaming. And then in 2001, you see Bakasura-Con, which is an anime convention, showing up in 2001, and then Vermont Comic-Con shows up in 2014 and runs through 2017. And this is part of this larger movement of conventions becoming really popular across the country. And when you have conventions, you have people trying to find fellow members of their tribe. They are looking for other Star Wars fans, other anime fans, other Walking Dead fans, and they are going to these events and they're finding them. This picture is we did a 501st Meet the 501st panel. The guy in the middle was going to be the director of Episode 9, Star Wars Episode 9. We interviewed him and took a picture. But there's other. This was a place where we actually recruited a lot of members within our own group, and because people are like, oh, I'm a Star Wars fan, I didn't know this existed, and this is just a way that these communities sort of find one another and grow and become really resilient. And that sort of leads to sort of a bit of a case study here. The group that I'm part of is, again, the 501st Legion. When I started, there was maybe one or two people in the group for the 501st in Vermont. And I went to college, and after college, when I started suiting up and doing these events, we called them troops. I was always driving down to Massachusetts or New Hampshire or Rhode Island or Connecticut to do these because there weren't really a ton of opportunities here. And as time goes on, as I was doing this, I was looking for events to do, and I was looking for, sometimes these are community events, or these are like, small conventions or gaming conventions or free comic book day. And, people started to come out of the woodwork and think, oh yeah, I'm a Star Wars fan, I'd love to do this at some point. And so we basically, as our numbers grew, we stood up the Vermont unit called the Green Mountain Squad. We based our patch off of the Ethan Allen Boys logo from with a bit of a Star Wars version. This picture is actually of a patch that we donated to our collection, and we actually recently had put in another one for our 5th anniversary, not too long from a couple of years ago. We were doing a whole lot of events here, and we would do things like the Burlington Kids Day, where you have a lot of kids who are the prime demographic for Star Wars fandom, and we'd go over and show hang out and show up in costume and take pictures and talk to them and greet them in character and bring that world to life just a little bit. And we'd start doing all sorts of other events from all over the place, and as that time goes on, our numbers grew, and we do a wide range of community events. This is from the Burlington Pride Parade, I want to say 2021. And this is just a way that sort of pop culture is sort of so ingrained in mainstream culture. We have members who are part of this community who are showing up and dressing up specifically for this event. And then the other sort of aspect of stuff we do, we work with organizations like Make-A-Wish, and we visit hospitals and help kids who are, life has thrown them a really hard set of circumstances. And so this is another thing that we've sort of done here in the state. And there's lots of other cosplayers who have done stuff like this. There's a bunch of folks who have dressed up as Marvel characters who have visited kids in hospitals. They go to conventions all over the place. They go to Montreal or down to Boston, and then they attend the conventions that are here as well. And all along, we're finding other members of our tribe, so to speak. So I guess sort of to wrap up with this a little bit this is a vocation that is really about community building, and it's really about trying to find one another. You're finding folks who are your fellow fans, and we're building these communities and finding one another. And it's basically just another part of Vermont culture, and you see this show up in all sorts of different ways. And I think it's important to study and to understand, because this is a significant activity for a lot of people. It's showing how events in popular culture sort of trickle up into our brave little state, and how we're not immune from these larger societal fluctuations as they come and go. nerd culture is a big thing, and it's worth documenting and understanding, what's the impact here in the state. And yeah, that's sort of the rough short history of cosplay in Vermont. As far as last note I have is sort of like what does the future hold for this? I'm not entirely sure. It's really going to depend on. I think we'll have. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think the popularity of these franchises are certainly still fairly strong. They will probably wane and fade with time or be replaced by other things. But I think it's worth understanding and worth remembering that costuming and cosplay has been around for decades, if not centuries, and I think it's definitely going to be around for that amount of time in the future. So that's about it. I guess if we have questions, Eileen, I don't know how you can. I'll leave that to you. How do we?
Great. So yes, thank you, Andrew, for sure. So if you do have a question, the easiest way to ask is using the Q&A function, which again, you can find at the bottom of your screen with all your other buttons. Again, you can also share information in the chat if you'd like. And we don't have any open questions yet, so I'm just going to start off, Andrew, with, and we've sort of talked, I don't want to say a lot, but there's, always have discussions around reenactors. And what has been your experience or sort of the framework between if you told a reenactor or talked to a reenactor about cosplay, and are they sort of like, yes, I'm a cosplayer as a reenactor, or is there really that big sort of line break between people who consider themselves cosplayers and people who consider themselves reenactors?
That's a really good question. A good answer that I have when I was doing research for the book, my wife and I traveled to Pennsylvania, where she's from, and we went to what is something called World War II weekend, which is a big reenactors open air convention, for lack of a better word. You have a lot of vehicles, a lot of airplanes, and a lot of people in uniform from every branch, every military every army that was fighting in World War II. And I ended up talking to a whole lot of. Actually, it was funny because there's a Captain America, somebody was dressed up as Captain America there. Not really a period dress, but I was talking to some of these guys about my age, and they're like, yeah, we like to do it because we like the story of World War II. We like the uniforms and the work to get the costumes, or sorry, not the costumes, but the uniforms right. So they are looking and they're doing historical research to try to find, all right, well, what does this look like? How do we get it to bring it to life by making it more and more accurate as we go? How do we bring these experiences and this history to life for people who are coming to take it in and to hopefully learn something about it? And I sort of had a realization like, oh, we're talking about exactly the same things. Somebody who's buying a suit of stormtrooper armor is going to be saying a lot of the same things. Like, oh, we want to make it accurate. We want to try to find it. How, talk about the story and why it appeals to us. They're just sort of separated by fiction and nonfiction. And I think that they're not quite the same. I'd say that they're sort of under the same umbrella. They're cousins. But the underlying motivations and the underlying techniques are the same. They are trying to accomplish very much the same thing, even though we're not talking about, wars fought galaxies far away. That's something a little bit closer to home. And, there's these massive communities that have built up around this. So there's certainly groups of people who will get together every couple of weekends to do reenactments or to do a photo shoot for, in their military garb, or Civil War reenactors who will go to battles and bring those battles back to life. And, even go back to Fort Ticonderoga, you have people who are trying to bring the past to life, in a very strictly educational setting. So they are trying to, show people what the people would have worn at the fort at that time. They would be also learning, like, what is it like to wear this type of clothing? What types of things we learn by taking this clothing apart and recreating it like they might have way back when. And when I was talking to the folks there, they were saying like, yeah, we learned, there were some archaeologists who found some pristine boots under the ocean, a shipment that had sunk, and we were able to learn some interesting things about how they were made, and they can and translate those into all right, how do we show people how these things are being made, as they would have been done at the time. Another really interesting example that they had was the uniforms at the time. They were built and sewn together with these really wide seams so that as somebody got older and maybe a little bit more voluminous, they would have been able to take the garments apart and then resew them so that they have that space, so that they can adapt to somebody who's grown, whose body is changing, as they get older. And that sort of shows you, like, all right, they're thinking about these. They're thinking about how these are constructed in that way. They're thinking about, like, what is it like to wear these? How are people approaching, their relationship to clothes? Which I found really fascinating, and I think that there you see some of that sort of trickle into the other versions of this sort of costuming as well. No other questions? I answered everybody's questions.
I have to say, you did a good job. I think one of the really intriguing thing to me, as you're talking, is sort of this using stories and characters, especially through time, is kind of a shorthand for shared knowledge and shared stories, or for sharing stories, but also the ability to bring in the individual into this as well, that everybody kind of has the ability to make it their own. So sort of a togetherness and a cultural togetherness, but also an individual aspect of each of these.
Yeah, there's something really powerful about hands-on learning. My alma mater is Norwich University, which was, they based a lot of their educational system on this idea of very doing things by hand, doing very practical learning. And our museum educator Danielle wrote a really great piece in our last issue of History Connections, sort of a fashion themed issue about how immersing yourself by putting yourself into clothing, putting in garments and using them as teaching tools can be really effective, because you're putting yourself into the person's, literally into somebody's shoes. What is it like to wear this type of garment, or to do this type of activity? It's another way to teach the past, and it's another way to really sort of drive that point home in a way that's different from just sort of reading dates off of a page. Not to say I like to read quite a bit. That's one way I like to learn, but it's also really quite something to be putting on a uniform. And so like if you're like a Civil War reenactor, put on a uniform, put on the backpack, carry the gun, put on the hat, and then march miles and miles. And then what does that physical experience teach you? Another sort of, to take it back to sort of the cosplay part, when I'm making it, I've made a couple of sets of Stormtrooper armor, and the way that I make that armor is pretty much the same that they would have made for the films themselves. And actually, you can get very close to that, because the guy who made the original costumes for the film back in 1970s still has the molds and still selling them. You can't buy them in the US because there's a whole bunch of lawsuits over that, but you can actually buy as screen accurate as possible without actually having the original costumes, but you can buy the armor as it looks in the films, and you can construct it in exactly the same way. You're cutting the plastic up, you're shaping it, you are gluing it together or riveting it together. And it's not just the story that you're immersing yourself with, the fictional story, but you're also sort of playing with a little bit of film history as well. Like, this is how these props were put together. This is why they were constructed the way they were constructed. And that, I think, is a really kind of a cool element of this particular strain of fandom, because there's so much to Star Wars fandom, and we're all a little bit nuts, but we can sort of immerse ourselves in that. One of the funniest things I've seen people cosplaying as is I see stormtroopers and characters all over the place. A bunch of years ago, Columbia Jackets redid the crew jackets that the crew for The Empire Strikes Back wore up in like Norway during the winter scenes on Hoth. They're these bright blue and orange jumpsuits or winter suits, and basically Columbia recreated them and sold them. And I was at a convention and I saw maybe 10 or 15 people dressed up in those snowsuits with film equipment, and they were cosplaying the film crew filming the thing. And it was just really kind of an aha moment, because it's just another way that people are sort of leaning into this type of fandom and leaning into the story. I guess it's film industry reenacting.
Reenactor for everything.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, no, don't have, oh, do I do have a question? Ooh, do I have a question?
Is the SCA still an
Oh,
active
yeah.
group? Yes, it actually is. And it's one of those things that has, they have chapters all over the world. And there are tournaments I think they are divvied up into sort of kingdoms around the country. And there are groups here in Vermont that are active. They will hold tournaments and other events here in the state and elsewhere. And then there's also these major, sort of nationwide events that where everybody from all over the place, like sort of like Worldcon, will show up and hang out for a week in tents and this sort of thing. So yeah, they're still around. Another sort of element to that is Renaissance fairs as a sort of a commercial enterprise that popped up all over the country. I was actually a couple weeks ago over in Pennsylvania, and we visited one. And there's even like Medieval Times, which is a restaurant, like a medieval themed restaurant. So like, there are definitely elements of that community that have, really persist to the modern day. And you can go to the Vermont Renaissance Fair in the summertime. I believe that it takes place in Stowe every year. There's others sort of in the New England area. If you do a little bit of, I don't remember what the name of the local group is, but you can certainly find those groups doing reenactments over the course of the summer months. And it's a group that's also changed a lot with the changing times. There's been a lot of talk about how are we leaning into the story of medieval England, and how are we sort of incorporating like modern day discoveries, especially around like people of color and people from not just European parts of the world, but like others. And it's been interesting to sort of see how the group as a whole has sort of adapted and changed with time. I'm not an expert on the group specifically, but that's sort of what I've noticed over the years.
Right. Okay. I think that's our questions. Oh, and Tortoise says Scottish games too. Yep.
Mm.
Yep. All right. Great. Well, if no other questions, I'm going to say thank you, Andrew, very much. And again, everybody who registered for this should get a link to this recording that, again, you can share or watch again. And then stay tuned. We're going to be having more talks in 2024. We're working on finalizing details for those. But stay tuned on our website, our social media, which Andrew wonderfully manages as well, and our e-newsletters. And we'll look forward to seeing you there. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.